A suicide rocks Missouri politics.
Politics has gone so hideously wrong.
This week we're on location at UMKC as we partner with the Village Square to dissect the politics of personal destruction.
This campaign season seems like candidates have taken dirty to a whole new level.
Joining us are former Missouri Senator Jack Danforth, conservative political ad maker Terry Martin, political director for the Bush-Cheney campaign, Bloomberg White House correspondent Margaret Taliff, and prominent local minister Adam Hamilton, who was picked by President Obama to speak at the inaugural prayer service. And now to our moderator, Alan Katz.
We thought it would be helpful to remind everyone why we're here tonight.
Some political watchers are saying this could be the nastiest, most negative election season of all time.
Last week, a group called Citizens for Fairness put out this rather brutal radio ad against Tom Schweik.
Just look at him. He could be easily confused for the deputy sheriff of Mayberry. We will quickly squash him like the little bug that he is.
If you think you could ever vote for Barack Obama, consider this. Obama chose as his spiritual leader this man.
Now God bless America! God damn America!
I'm Joni Ernst. I grew up castrating hogs on an Iowa farm.
U.S. Senator from Texas, you vote for Texas. You don't enslave its children with unconstitutional laws and overwhelming debt. And you certainly don't do all this to please some guy that looks and fights like a turtle.
Pat Roberts moved to Washington 47 years ago. Here in Kansas, he rents a Lazy Boy recliner at a donor's house on a golf course. Roberts only visits
every time I get an opponent.
What do we really know about Greg Orman? Now, news reports show Orman has shady business ties to Rajat Gupta, one of Wall Street's most notorious criminals.
Rajat Gupta is a friend of mine. Rajat Gupta is a friend of mine.
In San Francisco, Nancy Pelosi's throwing a party for Kay Barnes, a ritzy California fundraiser celebrating Barnes' San Francisco-style values. Yes to same-sex marriage. Yes to abortion. Yes to amnesty for illegal immigrants.
0 jobs.
Not a single job
being
added.
No jobs created. Zip, zero.
People are demoralized.
I'm George W. Bush.
I'm Hillary Clinton.
I'm Claire McCaskill.
I'm Mitt Romney.
I'm Pat Roberts.
I'm Barack Obama, and I approve this message.
Let me start with Senator Danforth. I think this issue really sort of segues well into what you spoke out on recently, Senator Danforth, which really kind of, in some ways, kind of set in motion this very discussion that we're having. We saw the commercial. Why don't you tell us why you felt compelled to speak out?
Yep. Well, I mean, first of all, let me say that my favorite all-time constituent letter said in its entirety as follows: Dear Dishonorable Danforth, my father taught me never to trust lawyers, ministers, or politicians. You are all three, sincerely. Look, a lot of what we've talked about is ads, and that's clearly what we see before an election, and it's a big deal. But I think that something has gone wrong with politics beyond ads, and what's gone wrong is anything goes to win an election. So what happened in the Tom Schweik situation, Tom was very close to me. He was my chief of staff in the Waco investigation, and again at the United Nations. He considered me to be something of a mentor, and he was tormented by a couple of things. One was the House of Cards commercial, and the other was the whispering that he was Jewish. And so I was the preacher at Tom's funeral, and I had a purpose in that sermon, and the purpose wasn't just, to give voice to my own rage, which is what it was, but the hope of evoking some kind of response. And that was really the punchline of that sermon, that it's really time for people who are distressed about the state of politics to push back and to get in the faces of politicians and to say, you know, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take this anymore. And that was my hope. And here is the response that I got. I got a lot of emails, I got a lot of notes, I got phone calls from people, and basically they said, "Attaboy, Jack, that's right," but nothing else. And I got one memorable phone call from a man who's a very active Republican. I believe he's gay. And he called me up and he said, "What you said absolutely had to be said. Thank you for saying it." But he said, "I'm going to keep quiet myself. And the reason I'm going to keep quiet is I'm afraid of these people. I'm afraid of them." And that's where we are. I mean, the problem, folks, is not some weird person who makes these commercials. We're the problem.
Margaret, you cover all these campaigns.
I mean, ultimately, I think if the American public, which is about as amorphous as the media, uniformly pushed back and said, you know, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore, it wouldn't happen anymore. And the reason it happens is because, on balance, even if the guy who's making the ad doesn't feel awesome telling his kids what he just did or her kids what she just did, you know, you do it because it works.
Right.
Is that right, Terry? Is that why you guys make ads that a vast majority of the people might consider to be really negative and maybe beyond the line?
The negative ads also move numbers, and voters respond to them. And so the answer is yes. You know, part of the reason that there are negative ads on TV is because people watch them, they take in the information, and it factors into their voting decisions.
Nick, you got a question for us from the audience?
We're going to move over first to Kathy Crow, who is in Lenexa, Kansas.
How can we, as concerned citizens, legitimately sort the fact from the fiction in these campaign ads? Many campaign claims are not shown to be false until after the election happens.
Okay, let me turn to our representative of the Fourth Estate here, Margaret.
Wikipedia? No, I'm just kidding. I mean, it's really a great question. It can be really hard to sort out. There are, I think, a number of pretty good media fact-checking websites. In the absence of being able to find the information you're looking for, I would send an email or a phone call to a reporter in the local media who's been covering that candidate and ask them.
Terry, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't there a movement they thought they would deal with some of these terrible ads by making the candidate at the end saying, you know, "I'm Alan Katz and I approve this ad"? And the theory was there was a shame factor. Was that, do I remember correctly?
That is true, and that's part of the reason you see the disclaimer that you see today on the advertisements. Of course, there's a large number of these ads, and in a lot of campaigns, most of the ads are not in fact run by the candidates. Yeah. They're run by third-party groups who don't have to, I mean, there's a disclaimer there, right? But they're an independent organization that's run separate from the campaign, that's doing and saying the things that they want to do and say.
Okay, I have a question here from Jean Patterson, who is in Fairway, Kansas. And your question for us is what?
Is gerrymandering one of the root causes of the widening between the two parties, the extreme views on each side?
I think the answer is no. That only, I mean, at the federal level, only relates to the House of Representatives, not the Senate. The biggest concern that people in elective politics have is getting the nomination. The way to lose the nomination, the way to pick up an opponent, and there's a new verb, it's called to be primaried, is to stray from absolute orthodoxy, party orthodoxy. So you see it with, well, I think for people like Pat Roberts, and so this is the great aim of politicians: avoid being primaried, and the voices from the public, the people who vote in primaries, and the activists who determine the nomination are the people who are on the ideological edges of politics.
Okay, so let's take this and Adam, let's suppose I'm a member of your congregation and I'm a member of Congress, and I think I'm doing really important work and you think I'm doing really important work, and an issue comes along that I really think is a bad thing, but it's being promoted by my party. And I know that if I don't go along with it, I'm going to find myself with a very difficult primary election, and perhaps I'm going to lose the election. So I come to you as my spiritual leader and I say, what should I do?
Yeah, well, first I'd ask, do you really want to hear, or are you just covering your conscience? You know, I think the natural tendency is, I'm afraid of not getting reelected. I can rationalize and justify this so that I can continue to try to make a positive impact. And, you know, the politicians in our congregation that I know are, I hear people talk about, well, throw them all out and politicians are rats and everything else, but folks I know really want to make a difference. They do want to serve the common good. I do think once you get in office, it becomes very hard to think about possibly not being there anymore. And that's where I think some of these things come in. I have conversations with folks about, okay, you're going into this campaign. As your pastor, I want to encourage you to run positive ads. And I had just had this conversation with somebody who's not a member of our congregation, but a politician in Kansas recently. And I said, you know, I just tell you, the people at Church of the Resurrection would love for us to have somebody running for office who's going to not run these kind of negative ads. And his answer was, you can't get elected without doing that.
Well, we have John Martellero with a question in Lenexa. John?
Thanks. We had essentially paralysis in Kansas state government over the last few weeks, and a lot of the members who were unable to pass a budget said flat out that it was a phrase, fear of postcards, that kept them from being able to vote for anything that would balance the budget. And with that situation, I'm wondering, is there something other than just personal courage?
The only way to dissolve the power of that is either, as the politician, not to care and let the chips fall where they may, or as a society to push back against something that we think is a nuisance or interference.
Does the faith community have an active responsibility or proactive responsibility when you see something out there? Let's take the postcards we were talking about. I didn't see any of the postcards, so I don't know what they said. But if you looked at them and you thought this was really misrepresenting, or this was what was going on out there, do you feel that you have a role to play, an active role, or are you just sort of there to sort of try to give people a foundation to move forward on? There
have been some times where I wanted to stand up and say, this postcard you got in the mail is absolutely not right. I know this person. This is not what they're like. But I have not done that.
Okay.
And maybe I should have, but it clearly would have been an endorsement of the other person. You know, during the last campaign, we had one Sunday, Pat Roberts and Greg Orman were in the same service at the same time. And so it was, do I recognize the senator who's sitting up front while his opponent is partway back, and not recognize that one? And we have pretty strict guidelines at the church. We don't recognize politicians in worship during election season, just to try to avoid, because they all show up at our church somewhere during election season.
Imagine that.
Yeah, we get a lot of people become very religious during election season.
Okay, Nick.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of questions that are about morals and religion and ethics.
How do you react when someone invokes the will of God as the reason they are running for office or should be elected?
I'm very skeptical when somebody says, God told me to run for office. Part of what I know is that we're all spiritually hard of hearing. And that means that, that I may think this, and I never tell people, well, God told me, or because I don't know, did God tell me, or was it the indigestion after pizza last night? I think over time I've come to recognize the sense of urgency and a feeling that, okay, I think I'm supposed to say something here, but I always tell people, this is what I think. I'm not certain that God told me to say this, but I do feel a strong sense of conviction that I think this is important we talk about this. And so when somebody says, God told me to run, that's, for me, that's a real, I'm going to be real cautious when somebody describes they're running for office because God told them to.
Before we go to the next question, I was going to ask Terry, if somebody shows up in your office and they say, I want to run, God told me to run for the Senate, will you do my campaign? What would your reaction be?
My favorite story actually comes from another consultant, and this is a little sacrilegious, but he was sitting with a candidate who was thinking about running, and the candidate said that to this consultant, and the consultant said, the next time this happens, God's going to tell me, and I'm going to tell you.
Okay, Nick, what do we got?
Okay, Alan, Pat Stidham of Kansas City. Pat, where are you? You've got a great question. As we move over to you here at the Village Square, thanks for coming. Your question for the panel.
The ads that run, and ending with the politician say, I endorse this ad, that's great. Is there any way we could force politicians to endorse the ads that are run by these third parties that are hiding behind money, which is why one of the reasons I don't think we can go after the bully. You got to know who the bully is, and we've given them a way to hide.
There's a lot of legality around these third-party ads and how the coordination can exist between that candidate and the person who's running that ad. And the answer, the legal answer, is that there can be no coordination. And so I think to have a candidate stand there and do that would be a violation of that, and that candidate would go to jail or something. Somebody just went to jail for coordination issues.
Nick, go ahead.
Question from Barbara in Lee Summit.
Does the politics of personal destruction, the intolerance of the electorate for different opinions, and the inability of government to compromise keep reasonable people from running for elective office? And if so, what does this say about the state of affairs?
I think obviously, yeah. Who would want to be? I mean, people a lot of times ask me, do I miss it? And I mean, every day I get asked that question, do you miss it? And my answer is, I loved it when I did it, but I'd hate it now. I just hate it. And it's not just the nastiness of it and sort of the relentless nastiness of it, but once you're elected, they don't do anything.
Terry, do you think the level of people that you work with who are running for public office, that their perspective, and I'm not talking about their ideology, I'm just talking about their general view of America and what they want to do is different today than it was, say, 10, 15 years ago?
I don't think I would say that. I think most people who are running for office, think they're running for the right reason. But I don't think that there's been a decline in, sort of candidate quality. But I do think that there are a lot more reasons apparent today for why you would not run. And, that goes to, the 4 traffic tickets that Marco Rubio had that was reported on the front page of the New York Times, no less, 10 days ago, to larger issues, the lifestyle, the campaigns, the fundraising, which is an incessant part of what a candidate has to do, that, make it, for a lot of people, something that they're unwilling to take on.
Margaret?
I wanted to say something also about Tom Schweig, because I think what has hit home to me about that tragedy is that it really reminds us of the frailty and the vulnerability of politicians, the humanity of politicians. In recent years, both the public and the media have really sort of risen up to things like bullying of teenagers, shaming of gay kids in schools, picking at people on Facebook. There have been rampant, aggressive campaigns to nip this in the bud, to criminalize it, to publicly shame it. But the same thing hasn't really happened in terms of bullying in politics. And I think part of the reason why is because everybody kind of assumes that politicians can take it. Why would you get into this game if you couldn't take it? And maybe when you get into this game, you can take it. But I do think that stuff piles up. And maybe you could have taken it 5 years ago and you're in a bad patch and you're vulnerable. You're just, because you're a real person underneath the consultants and the war chest and the facade. And I don't know who is supposed to be responsible for monitoring that, but I do think that's something that I have thought about.
So Adam, taking this one point farther, if a young congregant, a person of faith, comes up to you, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, they want to sort of make the world a better place, and they say, I want to run for public office. Should I run or should I not run? What kind of advice do you give them?
First, I'd say, have you considered seminary? You might be able to make the world a better place without having to undergo all the rest of that by being a pastor. But no, I tell people, this is a high calling. I think public service matters, and we need really great people. We need gifted and bright people to be able to run for office. Just don't forget, these fundamental values that you bring to the table, and make sure you're doing this for the right reasons. It's not about your ego. Somewhere thinking about, I'm going to put my own ambitions and ego needs behind my desire to bring about the best, the greatest common good for the people that I'm serving. I think if you can find people who can do that, I do think the current environment leads a lot of those bright and gifted people to say, I think I can make a difference doing something else.
I think that's probably right. Nick?
I just want to make it clear, Alan, I have a lot of questions of my own, but I'm putting my own ego aside to get to the citizens' questions.
We appreciate
I'm just a simple, humble man. Laurie, your question?
Thanks. My question's for Terry. So for those of us, who work in business, we are always looking ahead 5, 10 years to see what the next big trend is and how we get ready for that, how it's going to change our business and what we do. So as you look ahead in your business, what do you see 5, 10 years from now? What can we expect for political ads of the future? Are they going to get meaner and meaner? Are we going to turn a corner? What do you see ahead?
I think about it probably in more tactical, technical terms, which is that in the future, when you're sitting at home watching a TV ad or watching a show, you will get a TV ad that is targeted to you. And the campaigns will have a better sense of, campaigns and others will have a better sense of what the people in that household care about. This happens a lot now with direct mail, it happens a lot now with digital advertising, and it will only accelerate. And so, that may have the effect of changing how the advertising is done in terms of tone. It may not, but I think what it will do is you're much more likely 10 years from now to see an ad that is relevant to the things that you care about than you are today.
Bob Schubert of Prairie Village has a question.
I want to know how we can force politicians to answer the question, how are you going to implement the policy you propose? Not just that you are going to propose immigration or Social Security or whatever. How are you going to do it?
I think that in a 30-second commercial, it is not possible to discuss an issue. It's not possible. It is possible to do a hit job. It is possible to destroy a reputation. That can be done. And what we're missing in politics, and not we, the politician, but we, the people, are missing, is the ability to focus on what is really important for the future of the country so that we can participate in setting the future course of the country. And it does not exist. It just doesn't exist. So one thing that we can do, and churches can do it, and this is not campaigning, it's not picking out a candidate, it's not endorsing a candidate, it's not even taking a position on an issue, it's doing nothing to risk your tax-exempt status. But one thing that can be done is to provide some forum for the discussion of what's important. Any organization, if you were to invite a candidate, maybe not both candidates at the same time, maybe 2 different times, so it wouldn't be so combative, but talk about what do you intend to do about the future of Social Security, and keep them on that subject for about a half an hour or an hour. That would be very instructive. And I'm going to tell you, any politician can duck anything for 2 minutes. This is what debates have come to, right? But you keep on that subject for a half an hour, and it's impossible to dance, and it is also impossible to sustain a negative, dirty campaign for more than about 30 seconds.
Nick, we got time for one more question.
Well, I think looking at the questions that I have here, it comes down to what is the fix?
What's the fix?
Yes.
Well, I'm certainly glad that I don't have to answer that question. We're going to start with Margaret.
So the fixes are really easy to identify and really hard to do. Personal courage, personal action, speaking out. Politicians not caring if they lose their job. People taking the time to get information so they can figure out whether something's true or not. And journalists embracing the part of their role that is a watchdog and a truth teller, and ultimately to expose the truth, not for something that's glamorous or will get a lot of clicks, but to be willing to get into the weeds, and when something is not honest, say it's not honest, and when something is important, write about it even if nobody cares.
Okay. Senator.
Become much more active, vote in primaries, attend more political meetings, get in the face of politicians, and speak to them not only about issues, but about the tone of politics.
Thank you. Terry?
I'm gonna just hit on one point. Margaret talked about the press. There's a big difference between the national press and the press at the state level these days. And we've seen a really big decline, I think, at the state level in the watchdog nature of state capitol press. They don't have the prominent reporters that they used to have. And that changes the way the coverage is conducted, and it shifts a lot of the burden has shifted really to campaigns to do their own research and talk to reporters and try to get them to be interested in it. But I do think that there needs to be a return to a sort of a more robust press corps at state levels, because that's where a lot of these races are. They're at the state. What we're talking about, you know, we're not talking about the presidential campaign here tonight, by and large. We're talking about Senate races, we're talking about governor's races, we're talking about congressional races, and there just is not the robustness at the state level with our press corps that there used to be.
Adam, what would you suggest?
Well, I'm looking around this room from here, and it looks like there's 320 highly influential people in Kansas City sitting in this room. What if all of us made a commitment that the next political season, we're not going to participate in, you know, and I find this, if you're sitting in a group and somebody's talking very negative, and one person, and everybody could be nodding their heads, but if one person says, you know what, I really don't think that's an accurate reflection of this person. They're a human being. And I think there's truth on both sides. Immediately the conversation changes. When one person is willing to speak up and say, I just don't think that's how it is. And so I think perhaps if we used our influence, and all of us know 100 people, you know, or 20 people, and so suddenly that influence begins to spread, that we're going to talk positively about the other, the political opponent. We're going to recognize probably the person on the other side of the aisle has some important truths too that we also need to hear. You know, listening, and then I'm going to use my voice to tone things down as opposed to participating in the ratcheting it up. There's 320 people in this room who could be influencers to bring about change in Kansas City. And how cool would it be if in Kansas City, the heartland of our country, we modeled this for the rest of the country? This is what it looks like. So,
thank you all for being here. We'll see you soon.